There is a moment that arrives unannounced. It does not knock. It does not wait for permission. It simply appears. Like a hairline fracture spreading across a windshield, it begins with something small, a single thought, a fleeting sensation, a question you cannot quite silence. And then, without warning, everything you believed to be solid begins to tremble. You wake up one morning, and the reflection in the mirror looks like a stranger wearing your face. The job you worked years to secure suddenly feels like a costume you agreed to wear but never chose. The relationships you've nurtured, the goals you've chased, the identity you've constructed, all of it begins to feel like a script written by someone else. A life you inherited rather than created. A dream you agreed to dream but never actually wanted. This is not depression, though it may wear that mask. This is not failure, though it may feel like collapse. This is something far more profound, far more terrifying, and ultimately, far more sacred. This is the moment when the architecture of the self begins to dismantle itself, when the ego, that grand narrator of your story, starts to reveal the truth it has hidden from you for decades. This is the moment when you realize the life you built was never yours. Tonight, we descend into that moment. We explore the psychology of the borrowed self, the phenomenon where human beings spend decades constructing identities made entirely from external expectations, inherited beliefs, and unconscious programming. We will journey through the origins of this false construction, witness its inevitable collapse, and ultimately discover what emerges when the illusion finally falls away. This is a story about every human being who has ever felt the ground shift beneath them, about the CEO who reaches the summit of success only to feel emptiness, about the devoted parent who realizes they've been living someone else's definition of love, about the spiritual seeker who discovers their enlightenment was just another ego game, about you, yes, you, who may right now be standing at the edge of your own awakening, feeling the first tremors of a life about to transform. But before we can understand the awakening, we must first understand how we fall asleep. Before we can reclaim what is ours, we must see how we gave it away. And before we can become who we truly are, we must confront the terrifying question: who have we been pretending to be? The ancient Greeks had a word, prosopon, the mask worn by actors in theatre. Over time, this word evolved into our modern persona, and Carl Jung would later use it to describe the social face we present to the world. But here's what most people miss. The persona is not just a mask you put on, it is a mask that, over time, begins to fuse with your skin, layer after layer, year after year, until you forget there was ever a face beneath it. Imagine, for a moment, a child born into this world. Pure consciousness, pure potential, no beliefs about who they should be, no judgments about what is acceptable, no fear of being rejected by the tribe. This child is, in the truest sense, authentic, undivided, whole, complete. But the world does not allow this to last. The parents arrive first, with love, yes, but also with their own wounds, their own unexamined beliefs, their own inherited traumas. Don't cry, they say. Be strong. Be nice. Don't be so loud. Don't be so quiet. Success looks like this. Happiness means that. Each instruction, each correction, each subtle or overt message begins to shape the child's consciousness like hands molding clay. Then come the institutions, schools that reward conformity and punish deviation, religions that promise salvation through obedience, economic systems that measure worth in productivity, social hierarchies that assign value based on status. All of them, consciously or unconsciously, delivering the same fundamental message. You are not acceptable as you are. You must become what we need you to be. And so the child learns. They learn to suppress certain emotions and amplify others. They learn which aspects of themselves receive approval and which receive punishment. They learn to split themselves, to exile the parts deemed unacceptable into the shadows of the unconscious, while constructing a persona designed to win love, belonging, and survival. This is not conspiracy. This is not evil. This is simply how consciousness has evolved within civilization. This is the price we pay for being social animals in complex societies, but it comes with a cost that few ever calculate. We learn to live as someone else. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio discovered something remarkable about the self. Using brain imaging technology, he found that our sense of identity is not a single unified thing. Instead, it is constructed from layers: the proto-self, basic body regulation; the core self, moment-to-moment feeling of existence; and the autobiographical self, the story we tell about who we are. That final layer, the autobiographical self, is where the problem lives, because that story, that narrative about who you are, where you came from, what you value, what you want, is not actually your story. It is a story assembled from fragments of other people's expectations, cultural programming, evolutionary instincts, and unconscious patterns inherited across generations. It is a story told by everyone except the one who is actually living it. The Buddhist concept of anatta, no self, points to this same truth. What we call I is actually a collection of borrowed elements, none of which constitute a permanent, unchanging essence. The Hindus called it Maya, the illusion that the mask is real. The existentialists called it bad faith, living in denial of our freedom and authenticity. The psychologists call it the false self, a defensive structure built to protect the true self that has been wounded and hidden away. But here is what makes this phenomenon so insidious. You cannot see it while you are in it. The fish does not know it swims in water. The prisoner born in a cell does not know they are imprisoned. And the person living a borrowed life does not realize they are wearing someone else's dreams like a second skin. They believe the life they are living is their own. They believe the goals they are chasing are their desires. They believe the identity they have constructed is who they truly are, until the moment they don't, until something breaks, until the facade cracks, until the mask begins to slip, and for the first time, they glimpse the truth. I have been living a life that was never mine. This realization is not comfortable, it is not gentle. It does not arrive wrapped in soft wisdom and spiritual platitudes. It arrives like a death, because it is a death. The death of the false self, the death of the borrowed identity, the death of the carefully constructed illusion that has been running your life for decades. The mystics call this ego death. The psychologists call it identity crisis. The spiritual traditions call it the dark night of the soul. But whatever name we give it, the experience is the same: the total collapse of the meaning-making structure that has held your world together. And tonight, we are going to walk directly into that collapse. We are going to explore its origins, its mechanisms, and its ultimate purpose. We are going to trace the journey from the borrowed self to the authentic self, from the life you inherited to the life you actually chose to live. Because on the other side of this, death is not emptiness. On the other side is something far more profound: the possibility of being truly alive for the first time. So let us begin. Let us descend into the origins of the mask. Let us discover how human beings learn to abandon themselves. Let us witness the architecture of the false self and understand why it must eventually crumble. The journey starts not in the present, but in the past. Not in your personal history, but in the deep evolutionary history of what it means to be human. Because the borrowed self is not an accident. It is not a mistake. It is an adaptation, a survival strategy that served us well for millennia, but has now become the very prison from which we must escape. The story begins in the origins of consciousness itself. Long before you were born, long before your parents were born, long before human civilization carved its first symbols into stone, there was a pattern being written into consciousness itself. A pattern that would determine how billions of human beings would come to experience their own existence. A pattern that would create the very possibility of living a life that is not your own. To understand this pattern, we must travel back, not just decades or centuries, but millennia. We must understand how the human brain evolved not for truth, but for survival, not for authenticity, but for adaptation, not for self-actualization, but for staying alive long enough to pass on genes to the next generation. Picture the African savanna approximately 300,000 years ago. Early Homo sapiens, newly emerged as a distinct species, navigating a world of predators, scarcity, and constant danger. These early humans possessed something unprecedented, a massive prefrontal cortex capable of complex thought, planning, and, most importantly, social cooperation. But this gift came with a shadow. The same brain that could imagine the future, plan complex hunts, and create language could also generate something entirely new in the history of life on Earth: self-consciousness. The ability to reflect on oneself as an object, to see oneself through others' eyes, to worry about how one is perceived by the tribe. And in that moment, the self split. There was the organism, the biological being that experienced sensations, emotions, and immediate reality. And there was the self-concept, the mental image of who you are, constructed from feedback, comparison, and social positioning. The evolutionary biologist Robert Trivers identified something crucial. Humans evolved the capacity for self-deception because it made deception of others more effective. If you truly believe your own lies, you cannot betray yourself through unconscious signals. This means our brains are literally designed to hide truth from ourselves when that truth threatens our survival or social standing. The anthropologist Ernest Becker, in his masterwork The Denial of Death, argued that human civilization itself is built on a fundamental lie: the denial of our own mortality. Unable to psychologically process the terror of knowing we will die, we construct elaborate systems of meaning, value, and identity, what he called immortality projects, that give us the illusion of permanence and significance. We build empires, we accumulate wealth, we achieve status, we create art, we have children, we join religions, we pursue legacy. All of it, Becker argued, is a defense mechanism against the unbearable truth of death. And all of it requires us to identify with something outside ourselves: a role, a project, a belief system, something that feels more permanent than our fragile, temporary bodies. This is the first origin of the borrowed self, the existential need to defend against death by identifying with something that transcends individual mortality. But there is a second origin, equally powerful. Carl Jung, exploring the depths of the psyche, discovered what he called the collective unconscious, a layer of the mind that contains universal patterns, symbols, and archetypes shared across all of humanity. Among these patterns, he identified the persona, the social mask we construct to navigate the external world. Jung understood that the persona is necessary. It allows us to function in society, to play different roles in different contexts, to mediate between our inner world and outer demands. The problem arises when we commit what Jung called the cardinal sin of psychology, identifying with the persona. When we forget it is a mask and believe it is our face. A surgeon is not a surgeon. They are a human being who performs surgery. A mother is not a mother. She is a human being who has children. A success is not a success. They are a human being who achieved certain goals. But we forget this distinction. We become our roles. We fuse our identity with our functions. We reduce the infinite possibility of being into the narrow confines of a label. And why do we do this? Because it is easier. Because it is safer. Because true authenticity requires standing alone in uncertainty, while the borrowed identity offers the comfort of belonging, the security of knowing your place, the relief of clear guidelines for how to be. The French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre called this bad faith, the refusal to acknowledge our radical freedom and the corresponding responsibility that comes with it. He gave the example of a waiter in a cafe who plays the role of waiter too perfectly, becoming a caricature of waiterness. The waiter does this, Sartre argued, because existing as pure, undefined consciousness is terrifying. It is easier to be the waiter than to be oneself. Martin Heidegger used the German term das Man, the they, to describe how human beings flee from authentic existence into the comfort of social convention. We do what they do. We think what they think. We value what they value, not because we consciously choose to, but because it allows us to avoid the anxiety of making our own choices, creating our own meaning, taking full responsibility for our existence. This is the second origin of the borrowed self, the existential terror of freedom and the flight into social conformity as a refuge from the burden of choice. Now let us add a third layer, the psychological mechanisms by which this borrowed self is constructed in childhood. The psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott made a crucial distinction between the true self and the false self. The true self, he argued, is the spontaneous, authentic core of the individual, the source of genuine feelings, creativity, and aliveness. The false self is a defensive structure built to protect the true self when the environment is not safe enough to allow authentic expression. Here is how it happens. An infant expresses a genuine need or feeling. If the caregiver responds with attunement, meeting the need, reflecting the feeling, the infant learns that their authentic self is acceptable. But if the caregiver is unavailable, neglectful, or punishing, the infant learns something else. My authentic self is dangerous. It causes abandonment. It must be hidden. And so begins the construction of the false self. The child learns to present what the caregivers want to see, rather than what they genuinely feel. They learn to perform emotions they do not feel and suppress emotions they do. They learn that love is conditional, that it must be earned through being who others need them to be. This pattern repeats across millions of interactions throughout childhood and adolescence. Parents who project their own unlived dreams onto their children, teachers who reward compliance and punish independence, peer groups that enforce strict codes of acceptable behavior, religious communities that shame certain desires and sanctify others, economic systems that measure human value in productivity and consumption. Layer by layer, interaction by interaction, the false self grows stronger, while the true self retreats deeper into hiding. And because this happens gradually, unconsciously, before the development of full self-awareness, the individual never realizes what is happening. They simply become who they think they are supposed to be. The neuroscientist Jaak Panksepp identified 7 primary emotional systems in the mammalian brain: seeking, fear, rage, lust, care, panic, grief, and play. Each of these systems is essential to healthy psychological functioning. But in the process of socialization, certain systems are amplified while others are suppressed. Boys learn to suppress care and amplify rage. Girls learn to suppress rage and amplify care. Workers learn to suppress play and amplify seeking. The religious learn to suppress lust and amplify panic. Each culture, each family system, each social context has its own rules about which emotional systems are acceptable and which must be exiled. And when you exile parts of your emotional reality, where do they go? Jung had the answer: into the shadow. The shadow is not just the dark or negative parts of the self, it is everything, positive and negative, that has been excluded from the persona. It is the unlived life, the forbidden desires, the suppressed talents, the exiled aspects of being that were deemed unacceptable. The shadow grows in the unconscious, gaining power through suppression. It influences behavior through projection, symptoms, and unconscious sabotage. The person who identifies entirely with being good will secretly feel drawn to bad people or situations. The person who identifies entirely with being rational will find themselves overwhelmed by inexplicable emotions. The person who identifies entirely with being successful will unconsciously undermine their own achievements. This is the third origin of the borrowed self, the developmental trauma of conditional love and the creation of a false self as a survival strategy. But there is one more layer we must understand, one that has become exponentially more powerful in recent decades: the technological amplification of the false self. We live in an age where identity has become a commodity, where the self is not something you are, but something you curate, optimize, and brand. Social media platforms have turned the construction of persona into a 24/7 occupation. We don't just live our lives, we perform them for an audience of hundreds or thousands or millions. The psychologist Sherry Turkle observed that we have become alone together, constantly connected digitally while increasingly disconnected from authentic presence. We present edited versions of our lives, carefully filtering out anything that doesn't fit the narrative we're selling. And in the process, we become alienated from our own direct experience. The algorithm knows you better than you know yourself. It predicts your behavior with unsettling accuracy, not because it understands your authentic self, but because it understands your patterns of conditioning, your unconscious responses, your borrowed desires. It serves you content that reinforces who you already think you are, creating echo chambers that make the false self seem more real, more solid, more inevitable. The philosopher Byung-Chul Han writes about the achievement society, the shift from external oppression to internal compulsion. We are no longer forced to work. We are driven by an internalized demand for optimization, productivity, and performance. We exploit ourselves more efficiently than any external power ever could. We become both master and slave, internalizing the borrowed values of endless growth, perpetual improvement, and never being enough. And so the false self in the 21st century becomes something unprecedented, a carefully constructed personal brand, optimized for maximum social capital, measured in likes, shares, and followers. An identity designed by committee, the committee of market forces, algorithmic manipulation, and mass psychology. But here is what all of these origins share. They work. The borrowed self succeeds at what it was designed to do. It keeps you alive. It gets you love, or what passes for love. It earns you success, or what passes for success. It gives you identity, or what passes for identity. It provides meaning, or what passes for meaning. For years, sometimes decades, the borrowed self functions perfectly. You climb the ladder, you check the boxes, you accumulate the markers of a life well lived. You become who you were supposed to become. You build what you were supposed to build. You achieve what you were supposed to achieve. And that is precisely why the collapse is so devastating when it comes. Because the borrowed self is not just a failure. It is a success that ultimately fails. It is a victory that tastes like defeat. It is an arrival at a destination that turns out to be the wrong address. The ancient Greeks understood this in their tragedies. Oedipus does everything right according to fate and prophecy, only to discover he has done everything wrong. The tragic hero's downfall comes not from weakness, but from the very strengths they believed would save them. The qualities they cultivated, the path they followed, the identity they constructed, all of it leads inexorably to the moment when everything falls apart. This is not because they did something wrong. It is because they did what they thought was right according to a borrowed script, an inherited program, an unexamined set of assumptions about what constitutes a good life. And now we approach the edge, the moment when the structure begins to crack, the moment when the first questions arise, the moment when the person living the borrowed life begins, however dimly, to sense that something is deeply, profoundly wrong. What happens at that edge? What are the signs that the false self is beginning to collapse? What does it feel like when the life you built starts to reveal itself as an elaborate construction rather than an authentic expression? To understand this, we must now descend into the darkness. We must witness the collapse itself. We must experience what happens when the borrowed self can no longer sustain the illusion, when the mask begins to crack, when the ego faces its own death. This is where the story gets difficult. This is where we enter the territory of crisis, breakdown, and what the mystics call the dark night of the soul. But we must go there, because only by understanding the descent can we appreciate the possibility of resurrection. Let us continue into Act 2. the conflict, the dissent, the collapse of everything you thought you were. It begins with a whisper, a feeling you cannot quite name, a restlessness that has no obvious cause, a sense that something is missing even when you have everything you thought you wanted. You tell yourself it's just stress, burnout, a phase, midlife crisis, quarter-life existential doubt, depression. You reach for the usual explanations, the comfortable diagnoses, anything to avoid the truth that is trying to surface. But the whisper grows louder. You wake at 3 a.m. and the silence of the bedroom feels oppressive. Your partner sleeps beside you, someone you chose, someone you love, someone who fits perfectly into the life you've built. But in this moment, you feel completely alone. Not just physically alone, but existentially alone, as if you are the only person aware that something fundamental is wrong. You go to the job that defined you, the job you trained for, sacrificed for, built your entire adult identity around. You sit at your desk, attend your meetings, respond to your emails, and all of it feels like you are watching someone else live your life, like you are a ghost haunting your own existence, going through the motions of a character you no longer believe in. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard described this feeling as despair, but not despair in the ordinary sense. He distinguished between despair that knows itself and despair that doesn't know itself. Most people, he argued, live in unconscious despair, aware that something is wrong, but unable to identify what. They medicate the feeling with distraction, addiction, busyness, consumption. They blame their circumstances rather than questioning their entire way of being. But there comes a moment when unconscious despair becomes conscious, when the feeling can no longer be suppressed, rationalized, or medicated away, when you can no longer avoid the terrifying question, what if everything I've built is built on a foundation of lies? This question does not arrive gently. It arrives like an earthquake. Let me tell you about Sarah. The names change, but the story is always the same. Sarah spent 15 years becoming one of the youngest partners at a prestigious law firm. She worked 80-hour weeks. She sacrificed relationships, health, hobbies, everything on the altar of achievement. And when she finally made partner, she felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction. Just a hollow exhaustion and a question she could no longer silence. Why did I want this? She couldn't answer. She tried to remember why she went to law school in the first place, and all she could find were fragments of other people's voices. Her father, who never finished college, living vicariously through her degrees. Her competitive older sister, whose accomplishments she was always trying to match. The prestige-obsessed culture of her undergraduate institution. The fear that any other path would mean failure. She realized she had spent 15 years living a life her father wanted, chasing a version of success her culture defined, becoming a person she thought she should be. And the person she actually was, the one who loved writing poetry, who felt most alive in nature, who craved quiet and depth and authentic connection, that person had been starved, silenced, and buried alive. Or consider Marcus. Military family, 3 generations of service. He enlisted at 18 because that's what you did in his family. He was good at it, respected, promoted, decorated. But after his second deployment, something broke. Not PTSD in the conventional sense, though there was trauma. Something deeper. A fundamental disillusionment with the entire structure of meaning that had organized his life. He looked at the flag and felt nothing. He looked at his medals and saw costume jewelry. He looked at his brothers in arms and saw other people living borrowed lives, playing roles in a story written by old men who would never face the consequences of their decisions. And he realized, I have been an actor in someone else's war, a character in someone else's narrative of honor and duty. The philosopher Albert Camus wrote about the moment when life's absurdity becomes conscious. The routine continues, wake, work, sleep, repeat, but the person performing the routine suddenly stands outside it, observing the mechanical nature of their existence. Like Sisyphus pushing his boulder up the mountain, they see the futility of the endless cycle but cannot escape it. Or can they? the crisis deepens, the symptoms multiply. Some people experience it as physical breakdown. The body, carrying the unconscious truths the mind refuses to acknowledge, begins to rebel. Chronic pain, autoimmune conditions, exhaustion that no amount of sleep can cure. The body is speaking a language the conscious mind has not yet learned to hear. You cannot continue living like this. Others experience it as emotional collapse, panic attacks that seem to come from nowhere, depression that resists all intervention, sudden eruptions of rage that feel disproportionate to their triggers, but are actually proportionate to decades of suppressed truth. Emotional breakdowns that look like mental illness, but are actually psychological wisdom, the psyche forcing a confrontation with what has been denied. Still others experience it as spiritual crisis, the religious person who suddenly cannot pray, the spiritual seeker who realizes their entire practice has been another ego game, the atheist who feels a desperate need for meaning but has no framework to make sense of it, a dark night where all the old certainties dissolve and nothing new has yet emerged to replace them. The psychiatrist Kazimierz Dąbrowski studied what he called positive disintegration, the theory that psychological crisis is often a sign of growth rather than pathology. He argued that some people must break down in order to break through, that the disintegration of old structures is necessary for new, more authentic structures to emerge, that what looks like mental illness might actually be the painful process of transformation. But in the midst of the crisis, this knowledge provides little comfort, because the experience of positive disintegration is indistinguishable from the experience of total collapse. How do you know if you're transforming or just falling apart? How do you distinguish between a breakdown that leads to breakthrough and a breakdown that leads to the psych ward? The psychologist James Hollis writes about the middle passage, the midlife transition, where the question shifts from "how do I fit in" to "who am I really?" This passage often feels like death because, in a sense, it is death. The death of the provisional personality that served you in the first half of life, but is insufficient for the second. But the crisis is not always age-dependent. Sometimes it comes at 25, sometimes at 50, sometimes at 70, when you realize you've spent an entire lifetime being who others needed you to be. The timing matters less than the fundamental dynamic, the collision between the false self and something deeper that refuses to remain hidden. Jung called this deeper something the self with a capital S, the totality of the psyche, both conscious and unconscious, striving toward wholeness. The self, he argued, has its own intelligence, its own agenda. And when the ego strays too far from the self's purpose, when the conscious personality becomes too disconnected from unconscious reality, the self intervenes, sometimes gently through dreams and symptoms, sometimes forcefully through crisis and collapse. The self does not care about your comfort. It cares about your completeness, and it will destroy your carefully constructed life if that life stands in the way of your individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are. This is the terrifying truth about the crisis. It is not an accident. It is not a punishment. It is an invitation to let something die, an invitation to release your grip on the borrowed identity, an invitation to stop running from the question you have been avoiding your entire life. Who am I when I am no longer who I thought I was? But accepting this invitation feels impossible, because to let the false self die means to experience ego death. And ego death feels exactly like actual death. In the traditions of shamanic initiation, the apprentice undergoes a ritual death. They are symbolically killed, dismembered, and then reassembled with new knowledge and power. In the mystical traditions, this is the dark night, the complete loss of all previous anchors of meaning and identity. In psychedelic experiences, it is the moment of dissolution, when the boundaries of self dissolve and you face the terror of non-existence. The religious scholar Alan Watts described ego death as the realization that the separate self is an illusion, that what you thought was you was actually a collection of thoughts, memories, and sensations with no permanent, unchanging essence at its core. This realization can be liberating, or it can be terrifying. Often it is both. Because if there is no permanent self, then who am I? If the identity I've constructed is revealed as a fiction, what remains? If I'm not my job, my roles, my achievements, my relationships, my beliefs, then what am I? Nothing. And that nothing is what the ego fears more than anything. Not death in the physical sense, but ontological death, the death of the meaning-making structure that creates the sense of being someone. Imagine standing at the edge of an abyss. You can see the ground you're standing on crumbling. You know you must step forward into the void, but you cannot see what lies on the other side. You cannot know if there will be another ground to land on, or if you will fall forever. Faith is required. But faith in what? God? The universe? The process itself? Most people faced with this abyss retreat. They cling to the crumbling ground. They double down on the borrowed identity. They tell themselves the crisis is just a phase. They medicate, distract, busy themselves back into unconsciousness. They choose the comfort of the familiar prison over the terror of unknown freedom. But some people cannot retreat, either because the ground has completely disintegrated beneath them, or because something in them refuses to go back to sleep. For these people, there is no choice but to step into the void, to allow the death, to surrender to the process, even though every survival instinct screams against it. This is the descent into darkness that every wisdom tradition describes. Inanna descending into the underworld, stripped of all her powers and adornments at each gate, Christ in the tomb, between crucifixion and resurrection, the Buddha facing Mara under the Bodhi tree, Dante lost in the dark wood, midway through life's journey. The pattern is universal because the experience is universal. Every human being who wakes up from the borrowed life must pass through this darkness. There are no shortcuts. There is no way around it. The only way out is through. And what happens in the darkness? First there is grief. Immense, overwhelming grief for the life you will never have. The person you spent decades becoming, who must now die. The dreams you chased that must now be released. The identity you fought so hard to establish that must now dissolve. This is not indulgent wallowing. This is necessary mourning. You must grieve the false self before you can birth the authentic one. Second, there is rage. Anger at yourself for wasting so much time living a borrowed life. Anger at the people who programmed you, parents, teachers, culture, society. Anger at the systems that profit from your unconsciousness. Anger at God, the universe, or whatever power allowed this deception to continue for so long. This rage must be felt and expressed, not because it changes the past, but because it breaks the chains of resentment that bind you to it. Third, there is fear, the terror of uncertainty, the panic of not knowing who you are or what you want or where you're going, the horror of realizing you must now make choices without the guidebook, without the script, without the safety of knowing the right answer. This fear is the price of freedom. You must be willing to pay it. And finally, after all of this, there comes a silence, a stillness, an emptiness that is not depression, but spaciousness. The storm passes, the noise quiets, and in that silence, something new becomes possible. But we are not there yet. We are still in the heart of the darkness, still in the collapse, still witnessing the death of everything that once felt solid and real. And before we can move to rebirth, we must fully honor the reality of this death. We must let it complete itself. Because premature resurrection is just another form of avoidance. Another way the ego tries to reassemble itself using slightly different materials, but the same blueprint. True transformation requires complete dissolution, total ego death, the willingness to be nothing for as long as it takes for something authentic to emerge. The Zen teacher, Bernie Glassman, speaks of bearing witness, the practice of sitting with suffering without trying to fix it or flee from it, just being present to what is, in all its unbearable reality. This bearing witness is what happens in the deepest part of the descent. You stop fighting. You stop trying to make meaning. You stop trying to understand or control or manage. You simply allow yourself to be suspended in the darkness, trusting that the darkness itself is the medicine. The alchemists called this stage nigredo, blackening, the rotting of old forms so that new forms can emerge. The psychologists call it regression in service of the ego. The spiritual traditions call it purgation. But whatever name we give it, the experience is one of dissolution, disorientation, and profound uncertainty. And yet, here is the paradox. There is also a strange kind of relief, because in the complete collapse of the false self, there is finally permission to stop pretending, finally permission to stop performing, finally permission to not know, not have it together, not be who you're supposed to be. There is a Japanese aesthetic concept, wabi-sabi, the beauty of imperfection, impermanence, and incompleteness. In the West, we are taught to fear brokenness. But what if the crack is not a failure, but an opening? What if the collapse is not an ending, but a beginning? This is the threshold, the liminal space between death and rebirth, the pause between exhale and inhale, the moment when everything has fallen apart, but nothing new has yet emerged. Most people experience this threshold as a crisis to be solved. They search desperately for the next identity, the next structure, the next meaning-making system. They rush toward answers because the uncertainty is unbearable. But rushing is a mistake, because the threshold is not a problem. It is a portal. To pass through the portal requires something counterintuitive. You must stop trying to become someone and learn simply to be. You must release your grip on identity itself and discover what remains when there is no one left to be. And what remains? What is on the other side of ego death? What emerges from the ashes of the false self? That is where we turn next. That is the revelation waiting in Act 3. But we cannot arrive there prematurely. We must honor the death. We must let the old structures fully collapse. We must be willing to lose everything, every certainty, every identity, every illusion of control. Because only in that complete loss does the possibility of finding what was always there, hidden beneath the borrowed self, finally become real. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche wrote, "You must be ready to burn yourself in your own flame. How could you rise anew if you have not first become ashes?" This is that burning. This is that becoming ash. This is the necessary destruction that precedes all authentic creation. And now, having witnessed the descent, having felt the death, having honored the darkness, we are ready for the awakening. There is a moment, after the storm has passed, when you open your eyes to a world that looks somehow different. The same objects surround you, the same furniture, the same walls, the same sky visible through the same window. But something fundamental has shifted, not out there, but in here, in the quality of perception itself. You are not who you were, but you are also not yet sure who you are. You exist in a state of unprecedented clarity and terrifying uncertainty. Everything feels both utterly obvious and completely mysterious. And for the first time in longer than you can remember, you are simply present, no longer performing, no longer becoming, just existing. This is the awakening. But let us be precise about what we mean by awakening, because the word has been so degraded by spiritual commercialization that it barely means anything anymore. We are not talking about enlightenment in the sense of permanent transcendence. We are not talking about some blissful state free from all suffering. We are talking about something more subtle and in many ways more radical. We are talking about the shift from living as someone else to living as yourself, from borrowed identity to authentic presence, from the false self that was constructed to meet external demands to the true self that exists prior to all construction. The psychologist Carl Rogers spent his career studying what he called the fully functioning person. someone who operates from their own internal locus of evaluation rather than seeking constant validation from external sources. He found that when people felt genuinely accepted without conditions, they naturally moved toward greater authenticity, creativity, and psychological health. But here's what Rogers discovered. Authenticity is not something you achieve. It is something you uncover. It is not a goal you pursue, but a state you return to. Like the sculptor Michelangelo, who claimed he did not create his statues but simply freed them from the marble that imprisoned them, authentic selfhood emerges when you remove what is not you. And what is not you? Everything we explored in the previous acts. The borrowed beliefs, the inherited traumas, the conditioned responses, the false self constructed to earn love and avoid abandonment. All the layers of identity you accumulated, thinking they were you, are revealed to be merely clothing you can now choose to wear or remove. But who or what remains when all that is stripped away? This is where language begins to fail. Because the authentic self is not a thing with clear boundaries and fixed attributes. It is not another identity to inhabit. It is more like a dynamic process, a way of being, a quality of presence. The philosopher Martin Buber distinguished between I-it relationships, where we relate to others as objects to be used, and I-thou relationships, where we encounter others in their full, irreducible presence. The awakening involves a shift from relating to yourself as an it, an object to be managed, optimized, and judged, to encountering yourself as a thou, a living presence worthy of genuine attention and care. You begin to notice things you ignored for years, the way your body tenses when someone asks you to do something you don't want to do, the way your energy drains after certain conversations and expands after others, the way certain activities make time disappear while others make every minute feel like an hour. These are not trivial observations. They are breadcrumbs leading back to your authentic self. The Quakers have a concept, that of God in everyone, the inner light, the divine spark, the authentic essence that exists in each person. They practice listening for this inner light through silence and contemplation. In the awakening, you begin to hear it, not as a voice giving commands, but as a quality of resonance. Some things feel true in your bones, others feel hollow, even when they're right according to external standards. Jung called this process individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming who you actually are. It involves integrating the shadow, the exiled parts of self, transcending the persona, the social mask, and aligning the ego, conscious identity, with the self, the totality of the psyche. Individuation is not about becoming perfect, it is about becoming whole. And wholeness includes everything you previously rejected. Remember the shadow, all the qualities, desires, talents, and emotions you exiled because they were deemed unacceptable. In the awakening, you begin reclaiming them, not by acting them out unconsciously, but by consciously reintegrating what was split off. The anger you were taught to suppress becomes your capacity for healthy boundaries. The sadness you were taught to hide becomes your capacity for empathy and depth. The selfishness you were shamed for becomes your capacity for self-care. The wildness you were told to tame becomes your creativity and spontaneity. The weakness you were taught to hide becomes your capacity for vulnerability and authentic connection. This reclamation is not comfortable, because integrating the shadow means acknowledging aspects of yourself you have spent decades denying. It means admitting you are capable of cruelty and selfishness, not just kindness and generosity. It means accepting your full humanity, light and dark, noble and petty, transcendent and base. The poet Rumi wrote, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." The parts of yourself you most rejected often contain the greatest potential for wholeness. The things you most hated about yourself often reveal what you most needed to accept. As you reclaim the shadow, something unexpected happens. You stop judging others as harshly, because you can now see in them the same human complexity you've acknowledged in yourself. The projections dissolve. The black and white thinking softens. You develop what the psychologist Kristen Neff calls self-compassion, the ability to relate to your own suffering with kindness rather than judgment. But the awakening is not just about internal psychological work. It also involves practical, material choices about how to live. Because once you know the life you built was never yours, you must decide, what life do you actually want to live? This question is harder than it sounds, because the authentic desires buried under years of conditioning are often surprisingly simple, disappointingly ordinary, or socially unimpressive. You might discover that what you actually want is not the corner office, but more time in nature. Not the six-figure salary, but work that feels meaningful. Not the big house, but a small community of genuine friends. Not constant achievement, but simple presence. The Japanese concept of ikigai, your reason for being, suggests that authentic purpose exists at the intersection of what you love, what you're good at, what the world needs, and what you can be rewarded for. Finding your ikigai requires honest self-examination, free from the distortions of ego and conditioning. Some people, after their awakening, make radical changes. They leave careers, end relationships, move to different places. Others make subtle shifts, same external life, completely different internal relationship to it. Both are valid. Because authenticity is not about what you do, but about why you do it and how you do it. The key question becomes, am I making this choice from fear or from love? From external pressure or internal alignment? From who I think I should be or from who I actually am? Let me tell you what happened to Sarah, the lawyer we met earlier. After her crisis, she did not immediately quit. She gave herself time. She stopped trying to be the best and started trying to be present. She noticed that the parts of law she loved were the moments of human connection, sitting with clients in their grief, advocating for people who had no voice. The parts she hated were the competition, the billing quotas, the performance of prestige. She scaled back her hours. She started writing poetry again, not to publish, not to be good, but simply because it made her feel alive. She began volunteering at a legal aid clinic, and gradually, over 2 years, she transitioned from corporate law to human rights work. Same profession, completely different expression, less money, less prestige, infinitely more fulfillment. Or Marcus, the veteran. He did leave the military, but he didn't abandon structure entirely. He became a wilderness guide, leading at-risk youth on survival expeditions. He found that the discipline and rigor he learned in the military could serve a purpose aligned with his values, helping young people discover their own strength rather than fighting others' wars. He transformed his conditioning rather than rejecting it. The awakening does not require you to reject everything from your previous life. Some aspects of the borrowed self were genuinely aligned with who you are. Some values you inherited actually resonate with your authentic self. The task is discrimination, keeping what is truly yours and releasing what never was. The philosopher Simone Weil wrote about gravity and grace, the distinction between actions driven by ego and conditioning, gravity, and actions that flow from authentic presence, grace. Learning to tell the difference becomes the spiritual practice of daily life. Am I doing this from compulsion or from choice, from addiction or from freedom, from fear or from love? This discrimination becomes easier as you learn to recognize your own inner signals. You develop what the psychologist Eugene Gendlin called felt sense, a bodily knowing that precedes cognitive understanding. Your authentic self speaks through sensation, through energy, through the quality of aliveness or deadness you feel in response to different choices. This is why meditation and contemplative practices become so valuable after awakening, not as spiritual bypassing, not as another achievement to pursue, but as a technology for listening to your own deeper intelligence. In silence, without the noise of external demands and internal chatter, you can hear the quiet voice of authentic desire. But the awakening also brings challenges that must be honestly acknowledged, because living authentically in a world that rewards conformity is not easy. Some people will not understand your choices. Some will judge you. Some relationships will end because they were based on the false self, and the authentic self is no longer willing to play that role. The German poet Rainer Maria Rilke wrote about the terrible burden of freedom, the weight of responsibility that comes with no longer being able to blame circumstances or conditioning for your choices. When you wake up, you lose the comfort of victimhood. You can no longer say, "I had no choice," because now you know. You always had a choice. You just weren't conscious enough to see it. This responsibility can feel overwhelming, because now every choice matters. Every moment is an opportunity to be authentic or to betray yourself. The price of consciousness is vigilance. You must constantly choose yourself over and over, in small ways and large, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it costs you. But here is the paradox. This responsibility is also liberation, because when you take full ownership of your life, acknowledging that you, not your circumstances, create your experience, you become powerful in a way you never were before. Not powerful over others, but powerful in yourself. Capable of shaping your existence rather than being shaped by it. The existentialists understood this. Sartre's famous phrase, "existence precedes essence," means you are not born with a fixed nature that determines who you must be. You exist first, and then, through your choices, you create your essence. This is terrifying, but it is also magnificent. You are not a passive victim of fate. You are an active creator of meaning. As you live more authentically, something shifts in your relationship with time. Previously, time felt like a resource to be optimized, a race to be won, a deadline creating constant pressure. But authentic presence brings you into what the Greeks called kairos, qualitative time, the fullness of the moment rather than chronos, quantitative time, the tick of the clock. When you are genuinely present, 5 minutes can contain more life than 5 years of unconscious living. When you are aligned with your authentic self, you stop frantically pursuing the future or avoiding the past. You inhabit the now, not because you're trying to be spiritual, but because the now is where life actually happens. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, your relationship with others transforms. Because when you stop performing for approval, you stop requiring others to perform for you. When you accept your own complexity, you accept theirs. When you give yourself permission to be imperfect, you stop demanding perfection from them. The philosopher Emmanuel Levinas argued that ethics begins with the face-to-face encounter with another person, not as a category or concept, but as an irreducible otherness that commands our responsibility. In the awakening, this ethical dimension becomes immediate. You see others more clearly because you are no longer viewing them through the distortions of your own unmet needs and unexamined projections. Real intimacy becomes possible, not the fusion of codependence, where boundaries dissolve and identities merge, not the performance of relationship, where you play roles that complement each other, but the genuine meeting of two whole people, each secure in themselves, choosing to share their existence without losing themselves in the other. The poet Khalil Gibran wrote, "Let there be spaces in your togetherness, and let the winds of the heavens dance between you." This is what authentic relationship looks like. Two distinct beings, each complete in themselves, choosing connection without dependence. As the months and years pass after awakening, you notice something else. Life becomes less about achievement and more about presence, less about becoming and more about being, less about arrival and more about journey. You stop treating life as a problem to be solved and begin experiencing it as a mystery to be lived. This does not mean you stop growing or striving, but the quality of the striving changes. Previously, you were driven by lack, by inadequacy, by the need to prove yourself. Now, you are drawn by curiosity, by love, by authentic desire. The locus of motivation shifts from external to internal. You do things not because you should, but because you genuinely want to. And paradoxically, when you stop chasing success as a way to validate your worth, you often become more genuinely successful, because your actions flow from authenticity rather than desperation. People sense the difference. They are drawn to presence, to authenticity, to the rare individual who is comfortable in their own skin. But perhaps most profoundly, the awakening brings a shift in your relationship with death itself. Because when you stop identifying with the borrowed self, when you recognize that the ego you thought you were is a construction rather than an essence, death becomes less terrifying. Not because you believe in an afterlife or subscribe to some comforting spiritual metaphor, but because you recognize that what you actually are, consciousness, awareness, presence itself, was never born and will never die. Only the forms change, only the identities come and go. But the awareness that witnesses it all is timeless. This is what the mystics have always pointed toward, what the Buddha called anatta, no self, what the Advaitists call Atman, the true self that is identical with universal consciousness, what modern neuroscience stumbles toward when it tries to locate the self in the brain and cannot find it. You are not the content of consciousness, the thoughts, emotions, sensations, identities that appear and disappear. You are consciousness itself, the empty space in which all content appears, and that space cannot be harmed, cannot be diminished, cannot be lost. This realization does not eliminate the human fear of death. You are still a biological organism with survival instincts, but it contextualizes that fear. You know yourself as both form and emptiness, both individual and universal, both mortal and timeless. And in that knowing, there is a profound peace. The medieval mystic Meister Eckhart wrote, "The eye through which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me. My eye and God's eye are one seeing, one knowing, one love." This is not theological language, it is experiential truth. In the deepest awakening, the distinction between self and other, between consciousness and reality, dissolves into unified experiencing. But we must be careful here. This dissolution is not dissociation. It is not spiritual bypassing or premature transcendence. You do not become less human. You become more fully human, embodied and present, feeling and sensing, engaged with life rather than detached from it. The authentic self lives in paradox. You are someone and no one. You matter infinitely and not at all. You are totally responsible for your life and completely surrendered to what is. You plan and strive while simultaneously accepting that you control nothing. This is not confusion. This is wisdom. Living from this place requires what the poet John Keats called negative capability, the capacity to be in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason, the ability to hold paradox without collapsing it into simplistic either-or thinking. You learn to trust the process of your own unfolding. You learn that you don't need to know the whole path, only the next step. You learn that uncertainty is not a problem to solve, but a space to inhabit. You learn that the questions are often more valuable than the answers. And gradually, what once felt like loss, the death of the false self, the surrender of borrowed identity, reveals itself as liberation. You are free. Free to be exactly who you are. Free to live according to your own values. Free to create meaning rather than consuming it. Free to fail, to succeed, to change, to grow, to be messy and imperfect and beautifully, courageously human. This freedom is not the absence of constraints. You still have responsibilities, limitations, circumstances, but you relate to them differently. You are no longer their victim. You are their participant, their co-creator, their conscious witness. The authentic self does not require perfect circumstances. It does not need approval, validation, or recognition. It does not depend on external success or the admiration of others. It exists prior to all of that, a quality of being that is available in any moment you choose to return to it. And this is perhaps the most important insight of the entire journey. The awakening is not a one-time event. It is not something you achieve and then possess forever. It is a practice, a choice, a constant return to presence and authenticity in the midst of life's demands and distractions. You will forget. You will slip back into borrowed patterns. You will catch yourself performing, seeking approval, identifying with roles. But now you have the awareness to notice. And in that noticing, you can choose again. You can return to yourself over and over, as many times as necessary. This is the spiritual practice for the rest of your life, remembering who you are when you forget, returning to presence when you've been lost in thought, choosing authenticity when conformity would be easier. And each time you make this choice, you strengthen the neural pathways of authentic selfhood. Each time you act from your truth rather than your conditioning, you make it slightly easier to do so next time. Each time you honor your inner knowing rather than external pressure, you build trust in yourself. Over time, the gap between the borrowed self and the authentic self shrinks. The persona becomes more flexible, more conscious, more aligned with who you actually are. You can still play different roles in different contexts, but you know they are roles. You are no longer trapped in any single identity. This is what Jung meant by holding the tension of opposites. You are both individual and universal, both human and divine, both ego and self. You don't collapse into one pole or the other. You hold the paradox, and in that holding, you become whole. And wholeness, not perfection, but wholeness, is the goal of the entire human journey. To integrate all that you are, to exclude nothing, to accept the full catastrophe of being human with all its beauty and horror, its joy and suffering, its transcendence and limitation. This wholeness is your birthright. It was always there, waiting beneath the borrowed identity, beneath the false self, beneath the years of conditioning and performance. You did not create it through the awakening. You simply removed what was blocking it. And now, having returned to yourself, having completed this journey from borrowed identity to authentic presence, one question remains. What now? What do you do with this awareness? How do you live in a world that still values performance over presence, achievement over authenticity, external success over internal alignment? That is where we turn in our conclusion to the practical wisdom of living authentically in an inauthentic world, and to the larger implications of individual awakening for collective human consciousness. And so we arrive here, at the end of this journey and the beginning of yours. You have witnessed the construction of the borrowed self, experienced its inevitable collapse, and glimpsed the possibility of authentic existence. But knowing is not enough. Understanding is not sufficient. The question now is, what will you do with what you know? Because this knowledge carries a weight. Once you see the mask, you cannot unsee it. Once you recognize the borrowed patterns, you cannot unknow them. Once you taste authentic presence, the performance of false identity becomes unbearable. You now stand at a threshold that billions of human beings never consciously approach. And what you choose in this moment will determine the trajectory of the rest of your life. Will you use this awareness as a temporary insight, a brief moment of clarity before returning to sleep? Or will you allow it to fundamentally reorganize how you exist in the world? The path is not easy. Living authentically in a world structured around conformity requires courage. It requires you to disappoint people, to set boundaries, to say no when yes would be easier. It requires you to accept uncertainty, to release control, to trust yourself when everyone else is offering advice. It requires you to be misunderstood, to be judged, to stand alone when necessary. But the alternative, returning to the borrowed life now that you see it for what it is, becomes impossible. Because once you wake up, you cannot force yourself back to sleep. You can only pretend to sleep while remaining painfully aware. So let this be your compass. In every moment, in every choice, ask yourself, is this coming from my authentic self or my borrowed self? Am I choosing this from genuine desire or from conditioning? Am I acting from love or from fear? These questions will guide you through the labyrinth of daily life, through the 1,000 small choices that accumulate into a life. And each time you choose authentically, you create a future slightly more aligned with who you actually are. Remember, you are not alone in this. Every person you meet is living some version of this same struggle, trapped in their own borrowed identities, yearning for authenticity but afraid to claim it. When you live from your truth, you give others permission to do the same. Your authenticity becomes a mirror in which they can see their own possibility. This is how consciousness evolves, not through mass movements or institutional change, but through individual awakening, one person at a time, choosing to live differently. You cannot change the world by force, but you can change yourself. And in changing yourself, you change how you participate in the world, and that ripples outward in ways you cannot predict or measure. The life that is truly yours is waiting. It has always been waiting, not in some distant future, not after you achieve some goal or overcome some obstacle. Right here, right now, in this moment, in the choice to be present rather than absent, authentic rather than performed, conscious rather than mechanical. You are not the identity you constructed. You are not the roles you play. You are not your achievements or failures, your successes or disappointments. You are the awareness that witnesses all of it, the consciousness that precedes thought, the presence that exists before, during, and after every experience. And that presence is enough. You are enough. Not because you've proven your worth through accomplishment, but because your worth is inherent, unconditional, absolute. You existed before you became someone, and that original, unconditioned existence is your true home. The poet Derek Walcott wrote, "The time will come when, with elation, you will greet yourself arriving at your own door in your own mirror, and each will smile at the other's welcome. This is that time. The life you built was never yours, but the life you are about to live can be. Not inherited, not borrowed, not constructed from others' expectations, but authentically, courageously, beautifully yours. The choice is yours. The moment is now. The journey begins with a single revolutionary act, being exactly who you are. And in that being, you will find what you have been searching for your entire life. Not out there, in achievement or recognition or external validation, but in here, in the quiet knowing that you have finally come home to yourself. This is the awakening. This is the return. This is the life that was always yours, waiting for you to claim it. Welcome home. Thank you for journeying through the depths of consciousness with us. If this exploration resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Subscribe to Echoes of the Ancients for more journeys into the hidden dimensions of the human mind. Remember, the life you build from this moment forward can be authentically yours. The awakening is not an endpoint, it's a beginning.